Okay, so this is an audio review for Chapter 7, Meshing the Worlds of Work and Family from Diversity in Families. Okay, so in the chapter they talk about changing work patterns for women. So women's employment is something that has kind of shifted dramatically over the last, century. So in 1940, less than 20% of the female population was in the labor force, at least in the paid labor force. By 2012, the figure was 58% compared to 70% of men. So this was not necessarily done as a cry for liberation, but more as an economic necessity as wages for the middle class stayed stagnant and costs continued to rise. So some of the causes of increased labor force participation has to do with the change in the economy. The transition from manufacturing to a service economy has had the largest impact, right? So that means women kind of had to work as a way to supplant their husband's income in a system where, if we think of traditionally men as breadwinners and females as homemakers, that's obviously the kind of economic system we have now is very difficult for men to make enough money in order to actually do that. So that's part of it is manufacturing jobs were union jobs and they used to pay pretty well. But the service economy that has replaced it pays nothing. Also, just in general, a decline in real earnings. Families have become more dependent on women's earnings because of inflation, because of unemployment, and just less purchasing power. So sometimes women decide that they're part of their increased labor force participation is a reflection of personal fulfillment and self-reliance, meaning paid work gives women pride, worth, identity to be outside the home, right? Obviously, there's still a lot of preference towards motherhood and childcare, domestic work, things like that for women. But it is interesting to see how, obviously you get some of your social identity or social value from what you do as a job. So women realize that gaps in work experience can relate to lower pay and job insecurity. So they understand that it's in their best interest long term to work outside of the home. So some of the problems that women workers face, women are less likely than men to be employed if they live in a region where unemployment is high. It's difficult to find stable childcare, and also it's incredibly expensive. So that can be a hindrance to working. Like I have a coworker of mine that teaches as a professor that she basically decided to take a semester off to stay home and take care of her kids because it was actually cheaper for her to stay home than to pay for childcare because it was actually cheaper than her working. Meaning if she taught 3 classes a semester, she didn't make enough money to pay for the childcare of her kids. So increasingly, employers are also seeking flexibility in employees, and women might not be able to meet those demands due to home responsibilities. So especially if you are a single mother and your boss thinks that, a good employee is someone who can work extra hours, extra days, weekends, be flexible to kind of come in early, stay late, things like that. Obviously, if you're a primary caregiver for children, it's going to be very difficult to do that. And so bosses then see you as less valuable or less dedicated to your work. So that obviously affects getting raises, promotions, things like that. When it comes to men's employment, men's labor force participation rate has declined from what was 83% in 1960 to 70% in 2012. So the declines are not equally shared among all men, right? Declines were steeper for African American men than white men, so showing that race is a factor. And among white men, the declines were due mainly to early retirement age, not being forced out of employment. So when it comes to some of the causes of decreased labor force participation for men, some of this has to do with globalization and the way that the economy has changed as a result of some of those features of globalization. So advances in technology obviously have automated a lot of work spaces and jobs. So those jobs are just phased out. And then the shift from manufacturing to a service economy and this kind of information economy, right, have really had serious consequences for male laborers, especially those who used to work in industrial jobs. So right now, when it comes to those kinds of jobs, 4 out of 5 people that are losing jobs are men. So as manufacturing jobs have become more scarce, men are working in the service sector, which pays much less, right? Because these are traditionally female jobs. So, men do continue to supply the largest part of the family income, but the share that women provide is also increasing, right? So when we talk about the pay gap or the gender gap in wages, the reality is that yes, it's shrinking the gap between men and women, but not because women are making more, it's because men are making less. Alrighty, so integrating work and family. So just a side note, I didn't really mention in the PowerPoint here, but is a factor that they talk about in the chapter, is the changing nature of teen employment as well. So contemporary youth are less likely to be employed and work less hours than those in the past. So since 2000, there's been a steep decline in teens in the workforce. And I think obviously we can look at some of the economic changes and factors that relate to that. So teens in higher income families are more likely to work than teens in low income families, which kind of goes against the expectation since teens in low income families might need the money more. But social capital, right, having the right connections and the right resources is how you get a job. So it makes sense that higher income families have teens that have more access to better jobs. Teens enrolled in school are less likely to be employed than those not enrolled in school. And as rates of high school graduation and advanced education rise, the rates of teens working has decreased. All right, so going back to this integrating work and family. So the worlds of work and family overlap and interact in many ways. So work and family linkages vary based on those structural characteristics of each person, right? So a lot of that variance is created through class, race, gender, and all those other kinds of stratification systems we've discussed. So work-family conflict occurs when individuals experience an incompatibility between their responsibilities as workers and their responsibilities in their families. So let's say, your child is sick. It's your responsibility as an employee to go to work, but it's your responsibility as a caretaker to your children to provide them with health care and, keep them healthy. So that can cause a work-family conflict, right? Or you want to be present for your kid's soccer game, but that's when your boss wants you to work, right? So things like that can cause a lot of stress and strain for those that don't have that kind of flexible work or understanding, bosses, which is most of us. So spillover is the transfer of moods, feelings, and behaviors between work and family settings. So spillover can be positive or negative. Obviously, it tends to be more negative and happens much more frequently in a negative sense. But let's say you went to work and everything went so well that you come home with a great attitude. That would be spillover. But for a lot of people, it's the resentment, the bitterness, the problems that they deal with at work can really come home with them. Unfortunately, we can't just leave them at our doorstep. They do affect us emotionally. So obviously, it's difficult to kind of stop that. So for men, work stress is more likely to affect their family life, and for women, family stress is more likely to influence their work life. So it does go back and forth, but largely because men are expected to have more power and resource within the world of work versus women are expected to do that within the home. So it makes sense that those would be the factors that they focus on. Let's see here. When it comes to, also moving on, diverse work-family contexts. So gender inequality really affects the way that families work, right? This obviously structures the roles and expectations for who's doing what kind of work, all of those kind of, the expectation that women are just better nurturers, better caregivers, things like that. But it also, gender doesn't just affect, you're not just facing gender inequality at home, you're also going to face gender inequality at work. Right? So both family and work impose unequal demands on men and women. And so the demands of family will more often affect women's work roles than those of men, but for men the role is reversed. So their work demands tend to intrude more on their family lives. And this is again in a more stereotypical kind of hegemonic system. So the work-family role system perpetuates women's inequality in the workforce because it basically puts the onus on her to provide the care for the family while also working. When it comes to work factors, there's a lot of different issues that people face and, things they discuss in the chapter as to, how these kind of features affect our modern understanding of work. So the time squeeze is one of these, right? Time is a scarce commodity. As the economy moves more towards a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week work schedule, little time is left for families. So part of this has become shift work, right? This is on the rise, meaning that, instead of having a full-time day schedule, that becomes much less common. And nowadays people have shifts, but they don't necessarily kind of reflect the convenience of working 9 to 5 so that you can drop your kid off at school and pick them up from school or those kind of things. In less than half of dual earning families, men and women both work a, quote, regular full-time schedule. So that's less than half, right? So this is obviously changing. The nature of shift work is affecting families. So also the timing and scheduling of work is very important, right? So both men and women work more hours than they did 20 years ago. And the timing of work is a strong determinant of family life. Meaning if you're working graveyard, if you're working all day, if you're, these kind of things is going to affect the family interactions, the family structure, who's doing what responsibilities at home, stuff like that. So parents are, however, maximizing their time with their children and actually do tend to spend more quality time with their kids than 25 years ago, largely because the kind of cultural pressure on family is to make sure you're spending those kind of quality time and have those moments. So as much as parents are working more, they're finding ways to fit in that quality time. White collar and professional jobs are typically, have higher occupational prestige, and that comes with more money. So the more income that families have, there tends to also reflect marital stability and marital satisfaction. So that seems kind of obvious. Like, if you don't have to worry about money troubles, then you're not going to fight as much. You're not going to have as many conflicts, right? So a family may benefit from, success financially, but it may also force that professional to neglect his or her family. Because again, a lot of the jobs that are professional careers, white-collar jobs, like let's say you're a lawyer or something like that, where you're spending maybe 60 hours a week working. You're making a good income, you're providing a good standard of living for your family, but at the same time, they never see you, right? Because you're working 6-7 days a week. They have very, rare opportunities to actually connect as a family. When it comes to blue-collar jobs, research has found that characteristics of employment for industrial working class negatively impact family life. So new research is focusing on how women and their work, such as caring for other individuals in homes or nursing centers, affects then doing those kind of same jobs when you go home. It's just logic. If you go do something all day, like let's say you're going and cleaning houses all day, when you come home, you don't want to do that, right? Or if you're going and doing the kind of like stressful work of caretaking all day at work, the last thing you want to do is come home and do some more caretaking, right? So it just makes sense. So a lot of those jobs, though, too, that require more domestic work or what is, kind of societally, traditionally considered women's work, typically pay less. So there is that kind of consequence of doing that job, not just psychologically, emotionally, but financially, right? There's economic consequences for doing those jobs. And of course, how that affects then the family when they don't have, enough financial support, yet their parents are working, right? So professional satisfaction from work is another factor because work can, or, it may or may not be a source of personal satisfaction, right? Like I've had plenty of jobs that did not give me a sense of professional satisfaction. Though teaching, my librarian job, those things do give me a sense of professional satisfaction, right? That I actually get to use my education. I get to, kind of apply those things in a real world setting versus a lot of the retail jobs I had in the past, right? Working my way through college, which were definitely not satisfying professionally, right? Meaning, and again, a lot of research in the past focused on men's work, but nowadays we're looking much more at women's work and learning about those job connections and conditions that affect, or maybe foster greater control over one's life. So while retail jobs suck, they do often work well for college students because they often offer more flexible schedules that can fit around a school schedule. And they'll actually work with you to change your schedule when school arises. Well, some of them will. I've had jobs that were not as flexible, right? But, the ones that are available, the jobs that are easier to get, right, are the ones that have less desirable working conditions, that offer fewer intrinsic benefits, right?
And that may exacerbate negative characteristics that, obviously affect not just your life, but kind of cause that spillover. You go to work, you like, hi, welcome to whatever. Can I, would you like to try the whatever today? And that kind of dehumanizing, soul-crushing emotion work that happens in retail and service labor can obviously affect your mood, and you can come home with those conflicts, right? Like my mother was a grocery cashier for like 30 years. And let's just say, I don't know if you've ever worked in a grocery store, which I personally have. It's not great, right? You get all kinds. Sure, you get some nice people that aren't terrible. And it is fun, like what I used to do as a sociologist working there, at the time, amateur sociologist working there, kind of analyze people based on what they're buying. And yes, that's exactly what they're doing when that's happening. But anyway, at least I sorted the bags by like type, like cold things with cold things. And oh my God, I can't even. But anyway, so those occupations, though, you deal with everyone. You deal with the worst people in life. And you just get kind of a constant assaulting of, either disrespect or just kind of marginalization all day. So, I mean, just all power to her for being able to deal with that crap for that many years when, I did about a year of it and I was out. But, but, she did it because she knew that we needed health insurance. And that was something that, because it was a union job, was providing health insurance for our entire family, right? But, she often did have those conflicts, not just like with coworkers, but also just, these certain customers or things that would happen. I mean, she was robbed several times at gunpoint, things like that aren't great. And, those things can obviously exacerbate the conditions in your home because you're working really hard, you're working a lot of hours, but your paychecks don't reflect that. And you come home with the conflicts and all of those kind of things that have already built up over your day. It's very difficult to just leave that at the door and then be like, yay, everything's fine, happy, right? Because that's just not how that works. So a lot of that kind of work-family conflict is really related to the dissatisfaction that we have with our jobs, or depression or hostility that's related to, working hard, making low wages, or just not having jobs that give us the professional satisfaction that people deserve, right? All right, so some family characteristics that are going to affect, the kind of ways that people experience economics in the family. You first have dual worker families. So these are families that are now the dominant form in the labor force. Research shows that dual earners have high amounts of stress. I mean, obviously, both people are working, so that causes stress, being out there in life, doing those things. And also, women in those families tend to have higher self-esteem and a higher well-being. So there is something to be said about having the identity formation that comes with a career. For 20 years, research has found that the health factors for women working are significant, right? Because some roles can provide different kinds of gratification than you get at home, right? If you're just mom at home and all of the things you do, like you clean, you cook, you do these domestic roles, but those things are just considered like, yeah, that's your job. No one's like, thank you, what a great job you did. There's no, kind of reward, socially or otherwise, for those things. Then it becomes dehumanizing, right? So married women in working class jobs appear to be more traditional than professional wives. So another type of family is the wife as sole provider. So in the majority of married couples in the US, again, are dual earners. In about 8% of couples, the wife is the sole provider. So many women find themselves in this role as a result of unanticipated economic setbacks that their husbands might face, right? Meaning that women tend to, because of the gender segregation in the labor force, women tend to be in jobs such as healthcare and education, which have been, historically less susceptible to job loss than their husbands that might have had jobs in manufacturing, right? Because again, healthcare, education, only so much of that could be offshored or exported, right? Oftentimes you need people in those physical jobs here. But again, they don't tend to pay as well as, those traditional masculine manufacturing jobs. So in some cases, women take on the primary role of provider while men stay home and take care of their kids. And this is becoming more prevalent as a social phenomenon. But again, there's a lot of stigma that happens against those women working and those men being in those care roles because of those traditional stereotypes.
Women may also continue to work after their husbands retire, or maybe their husbands become disabled and they basically become the sole provider as a response to that. And another form of family is the single parent family. So about a third of all households with children are maintained by a single parent. And in that 1/3 of all households, 9 out of 10 of them are women who are the single parent. Okay, so there's also the issue of invisible and unpaid family work. So a vast amount of unpaid work is done in the family, much of it by women. There's also gendered labor expectations in households. So housework is the quintessential example of work that's done inside the family without any sort of intrinsic rewards. This is mostly done by women, and it is often called the second shift for employed wives. Right? The expectation that you work, but then you come home and you still cook and clean and do any of the domestic responsibilities. So other forms of family work that also exist are interaction work, right? Emotion work, consumption work, and kin work. So meaning, interaction work, the kind of processes and trials and tribulations that go into the kind of basis of our interactions. Emotion work is often specific to the retail industry, but, meaning when you work in a job and you're like, hi, how are you? Welcome to whatever. Would you like to try or whatever today? And have to kind of fulfill those roles of pretending to be either very happy at a job or pretending to not get mad when a customer yells in your face. But emotion work is also something that happens within the family and within the home quite a bit, meaning that women are expected to be emotionally providing for the other family members. They're expected to care about their feelings and their thoughts and their concerns. And, that emotion work, as much as it's also a way that people can bond as a family, it does serve in a lot of ways to be somewhat exhausting, right? It is still another kind of work, right? So again, the same way that the kin work of trying to establish the networks and relationships within the family, women are often considered kin keepers, meaning especially matriarchs like grandmothers are the ones that have to somehow organize the entire family, make sure that, holidays include extended family and things of that nature, and really kind of like organize and control the relationships in the family, meaning they can often kind of guilt someone into providing help or support to other family members. So that's still other kinds of work that go into the family that do take time, take effort, but also are not paid or not valued as actual work. So coping with work and family can be difficult for a lot of families. So a lot of families come up with coping strategies. So coping is the kind of essential point of human agency, right? Meaning that people push back against what they experience in the world. So balancing work and family life can produce a lot of strain, right? And it's a considerable impact on families. So families have to adapt, and this is, again, part of your project you're doing for your group project in this class. So for most families, housework and childcare are the most difficult things to deal with. So those are the ones, and when we talk later about divorce, that underscores a lot of it as well. The expectations, who's doing what of it, right? It can cause a lot of resentment if only one parent is doing all of this work, especially if they expected to have a more egalitarian relationship. So parents use a variety of strategies to cope. So meaning they might pay, if they have enough financial resources, for domestic help and for childcare, right? Kind of freeing up those hours so that they can either be working or, just have that time to spend in other productive endeavors, right? So most families rely on several strategies in order to kind of navigate the complicated nature of how the economy puts more strain on us and how do we adapt to it. So one of the ways that this happens is what's called split shift parenting. So this is a strategy used principally by working class families where basically trying to ease the burden of paying for childcare, parents will work different shifts so that they don't have to pay for childcare. So for example, my grandparents did this. My grandfather worked, almost 12-hour days all day, and then my grandmother worked graveyard. And so basically she would, pick up all the kids from school, get them home, make them dinner, get them ready for bed, and then she would go to work all night, come home and sleep. My grandfather would get them up for school, make them breakfast, things like that, get them off to school. And so that was the way that they were able to make sure that they didn't have to pay for childcare or worry about the concerns of having only one income. they kind of did that split shift. So that's something that a lot of families do to try to ease the burdens of paying for childcare, at least in some days of the week, by kind of balancing that out, right? So sequencing is pretty similar. It's the adjustment process of juggling competing demands by adjusting the timing of events over the lifespan. So that involves alternating paid work with raising children rather than trying to combine them. So again, another just example from my own personal life. I have a cousin that's been doing this right now. That she had a child pretty late, actually. I think she was like 39 when she got pregnant, and that was her first child. She'd been trying for a lot of years, and so what she had to do was kind of just even to get leave, she had to cobble together like all of her, you know, vacation days, all of her sick days, all of those things, so that she could get some leave off of work. But then she basically arranged it with her employer to have kind of a stead, so that she took off 2 years of working, that she knew she could go back to her position at the high school that she was teaching at before that, in order to spend the time just taking care of their kid, because both of my cousins, like her and her husband, both are high school teachers. They don't make much money. Like, they make okay money, but not enough to only have one income. So basically they worked it out and saved up so that she could spend a couple years just focusing on the kid before he gets into school, and then kind of transition into, she started working half days after this, fact, so that there's not huge gaps in her employment record when she's trying to maintain her career, but at the same time, having to pay for childcare like 5 days a week, all day like that, would have cost much more money than she earns as a teacher, which is insane. But anyway, so as a result, they kind of sequenced to basically, they took a period of, or she took a period of time off. Actually, her husband also took a period of time off to kind of set these things up. And then the idea is that you have these brief interruptions to your work schedule, so you can focus on those particular times, and then you kind of go right back to working. Right? So this is also kind of related to the mommy track. So this is a situation that leads to fewer promotions and opportunities for women. So for example, my cousin, she works at the same high school as her husband does. So think about who's going to get opportunities for, higher pay positions, for more, teaching assignments, things like that. It's going to be the people that are considered to be more dedicated, right? And if you take 2 years off to raise a kid, a lot of people misinterpret that. Instead of seeing it as, well, of course you still care about your career, but you also want to be there for your kid. And, of course, the financial limitations of not living in a system that subsidizes healthcare and childcare means that it's super expensive. So, there is a financial incentive to staying at home. So it's interesting that that can then be read by people as being less committed to one's job, when that's not necessarily what that means. So that obviously means that sometimes women are tracked into these particular, or basically part of this kind of glass ceiling that a lot of women hit is related to the idea that even if they're not moms right now, that later on they will be a mom, and therefore they don't care as much about the job, so they shouldn't be getting those promotions and that tenure and those long-time positions. Okay, so when it comes to support for families, obviously, the U.S. lacks social support for families that are very common around the world, such as paid family leave, meaning, oftentimes not just giving birth with like maternal or paternal family leave, but also people get sick. Like, what happens if you're, let's say you're an adult, you're in, your middle life, and your parent gets sick with cancer. What are you supposed to do, right? You're going to take time off to try and take care of them. In most countries, you would get that paid time off. You would be able to deal with the concerns of your family, but also be paid and not have to worry about going into financial ruin or losing your, house or apartment or whatever it might be, because you're not able to pay those bills anymore. So in other countries, these things come from a more kind of social democratic welfare state, right? That kind of socialism, the big fear of social democracies. But really, people that live there are happier, are healthier, like have longer health outcomes than we do. And this is a huge consequence that we face because we don't have these things, right? Also, low-cost daycare, right?
I was going to play this clip in class, but I can't include it in this video because otherwise they'll get me for copyright infringement. But a clip from the film Sicko, which I'm going to show you some other clips later, so maybe I'll work it in, that talks about how people that are raising children in France is one of the places he goes to. And they talk about how the daycare there is about $1 a day for the kids, or like $1 an hour, something like that. Something so ridiculously affordable, right? When they're like rated, they're trained, the people are all like childcare professionals, and they are still able to afford a system where some of these things come from tax dollars and they live a much better standard of living. Yes, they're taxed higher, but think about it. You could afford being taxed higher if you didn't have to pay for healthcare, college, or a lot of these other things like daycare and all these other problems that families face, right? Like there's even a system in France where they send you someone for 20 hours a week when you first give birth to help you. Meaning they just come to your house, they will, either take care of the baby for 4 hours a day so you can like take a goddamn nap or, go do some grocery shopping or whatever you might need to do. Or they will literally like clean your house or do your laundry, do something to help you out, because it's very overwhelming to have a newborn. It's incredibly difficult. They need you so much all the time, and they're constantly keeping everyone awake. It's, this woman describes in the video how she's like, that time is precious to her because it's the only time, her husband's working, she's home alone with this baby. Having someone there for 4 hours is like an extreme help. And then she looks at Michael Moore and is like, you don't have that in the U.S.? And he's like, no one in the government comes to your house and does your laundry in the U.S. And the lady's like, well, that's difficult. And it's like, yeah, it is difficult, especially when we purport ourselves to be the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. Yet we're not using any of that money to provide health care, to provide social support for families. To nowadays, we're even trying to take away, like they've already taken away school lunches in so many ways, or school breakfasts. Now they're going after school lunches because, God forbid a kid get a free school lunch so he can eat and actually like participate in classes and understand what's going on. And it's not that child's fault that they live in poverty. But those are the things that are under attack. We're actually providing less of these things at a time period when we need so many more of them to alleviate so many of these problems people face, right? So, down here at the bottom, I've included some video clips that kind of illustrate how our system is different than others. And again, I wanted to include these video clips in the audio, but I can't because one of them is HBO, and the last time I tried to post something of theirs, they came after me. So anyway, it violates YouTube copyright stuff, so that sucks. But anywho, so what I'd ask you to do is just after listening to me jaw flap through this part, just take a moment and watch these clips so that you get the kind of full context of what we're talking about in regards to the Family and Medical Leave Act, right? So we do have the FMLA in the U.S. It offers 12 weeks unpaid leave, right? Meaning, yes, you can leave your job for 3 months and they have to keep your job for you, right? But how many of you can afford to not work for 3 months and still be able to pay your bills? Yeah, not me. So that's really the concern, that it's unpaid, right? California started offering 6 weeks paid, and that's it. Versus, again, in some of these countries, like in the UK, you can get 6 months paid. 6 months! I mean, that's a big difference from 6 weeks, right? So we have a long way to go when it comes to providing resources so that we don't see such differential outcomes for different families, meaning we have really high rates of maternal mortality in this country, but especially within poor communities and, racial minority communities that aren't getting the same access to healthcare and resources. Meaning, if you can't get all those prenatal appointments and all the prenatal medications that you need to make sure your baby's healthy, you might have a baby with lower, birth weight, which is going to affect their health outcomes. So a baby born in Detroit has less opportunity or is more likely to die than a baby born in El Salvador. So this is a horrible travesty, right, in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, that we're not providing these things for our citizens. So go ahead and just watch these videos, and then that'll be the end of this.